The Kingdom Hearts Key Saga is a mosaic of many stories that come together to create a single narrative. For the last 8 years, this chronicle has served as a prequel to the Kingdom Hearts series as a whole, taking place in the timeline centuries prior, during the Age of Fairy Tales. The musical score for the Key games, like in Kingdom Hearts Coded, is also very consistent between the shared scenes in all the entries, but sometimes unexpected music would be used with some interesting repercussions that would add nuance to a scene or even subvert the meaning of some plot point. We can use our musical knowledge in how these tracks behave, functionally, and determine how these choices influence the intent of the overarching narrative. And if we're lucky, we may even be able to find small musical fragments in the music that can be used to link previously unrelated story elements together.
Way to steal my thunder, show off!
For all these reasons, it's important to acknowledge how the music of the Key Saga is used, because by understanding the musical narrative, in addition to the moment-to-moment plot, we will have a more complete picture to reference when trying to predict or explain some of the more unclear sequences that will appear later in the series. So what's actually part of the Key Saga? Well, Kingdom Hearts Key, Unchained Key, Union Cross, and Back Cover comprises one story told in multiple parts, but the relationship between these 4 titles is not immediately obvious. Key was a Japan-only PC browser game that ran from July 2013 to September 2016, concluding its storyline with the Keyblade War. In 2015, Key would be remade for smartphones under the title Unchained Key, with a story that would finally be released and expanded internationally in the following year, as Original Key prepared to end service. Back Cover was released in January 2017 as a supplementary movie with a new perspective on the Original Key storyline, and it was included as part of the Kingdom Hearts 2.8 collection. In April later that year, Unchained Key underwent a soft rebranding for its second season, introducing multiplayer gameplay, a theater mode, and a new story arc, becoming Union Cross. This final piece of the story continued where the original Key and Unchained Key had left off, and it concluded the narrative, as well as its online service, globally in June 2021. As a point of reference, 1 year before, in June 2020, the game had been rebranded again as Kingdom Hearts Union Cross Dark Road, which contained both Union Cross and the game Dark Road packaged together in one application that used similar assets. I'll be addressing Dark Road separately in a later video though, since its story and music uses are independent from the Key Saga. Now, with the goal of understanding how the music of the Key games was used, let me also quickly outline the scope of what I was actually able to look into. In addition to the 979 main story quests in the mobile game, there were also over 5,000 limited time events, many of which haven't been recorded anywhere, and so verifying the music for all of these was simply an inaccessible task.
Please tell me you're joking.
Sorry, I said. I found what I could, of course, but because of this, the aspect of Key that was most important for me to document was primarily the music for all the mainline story quests. Note the date of publishing this video. Due to Union Cross having concluded its service on the mobile phone, this musical analysis can only encapsulate what's been revealed on the platforms that have been released.
Your point?
The point being, I expect that if the full Union Cross story ever gets remade, many of its track uses will be improved in the same way that all other Kingdom Hearts re-releases had done with their music as well. So with all that out of the way, I can now present the official Kingdom Hearts 3 2.8 Unchained Key and Union Cross original soundtrack album that Square Enix released in November 2020, the last disc of which would include 17 new arrangements of music that had appeared throughout Key. While this is useful, it's not the complete soundtrack for the music in these games. Some pieces were newly introduced in quests after 2020, while other tracks just flat out weren't included at all. For the complete soundtrack, we can consult this spreadsheet that collects all the tracks from all the titles, and from this, we can comprehensively categorize every single musical moment from this collection of stories. The complete soundtrack for the Key Saga contains 122 tracks, 24 of which were new or uniquely arranged for these games, and 98 of which were unchanged reused pieces from other titles. As you look through this categorization chart, you may notice many classifications that might be interesting in different ways, and we'll address the more surprising listings and their placements in just a bit. I also wanted to acknowledge that the Key game's original soundtrack really only had obvious musical references to others, and they mostly came in the form of expected, dearly beloved connections.
Oh yeah, that. Bummer, huh?
Yes.
We will, of course, recognize any musical material that these tracks share with others, but I think the clearest way to speak about Key's complete soundtrack is to first go through its 24 originals one at a time, rather than through a relatively featureless motif chart. Let's go ahead and do that now. Key Saga Originals. The Key original pieces include many new Yoko Shimomura tracks, but also several unique arrangements of older pieces that were somewhat reworked for the mobile game. In addition to these, Tsuyoshi Sekito also composed new pieces that are sprinkled throughout the late game of Union Cross, and even Takeharu Ishimoto returns to give us another Twister remix. This original soundtrack is a wild ride, with many tracks taking a radically different compositional approach, so buckle up for the next little bit as I try to break these down. Before the Daylight and Wake Up World were both introduced in original key as the field and battle tracks for Daybreak Town, respectively. These tracks function like all other field battle pairs from throughout the series, but there are a couple of noteworthy and interesting uses of both. Specifically, Before the Daylight also accompanies the character and chapter select theater options for back cover, which was a strange, albeit safe decision. But again, this track's main purpose was as the field theme for all the areas in Daybreak Town, which include the clock tower, the sewer, the beach, and a unique area from a 2018 Halloween event quest, where the player character meets with Chirithy in what appears to be a common room with many doors leading to corridors of darkness. Wake Up World mostly accompanies events and quest battles in these places, including when the sewer crew celebrates clearing the beach but are later told that swimming is off limits due to a monster in the water, or when the players Key Kid and Ephemer notice a glitched spiral above the Daybreak Town clock tower and decide to investigate. Nothing really out of the ordinary here. Notably, there is just a little bit of a musical relationship between the field and battle tracks, this rising power chord arpeggiation. And like many other tracks she's written for the series, Yoko Shimomura is not shy of modal exploration in her compositions. I mean, previously she's played around with musical colors like Dorian in Scherzo di Notte, and even Phrygian in Sacred Moon, and...
I apologize. I overstepped.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get so anatomical with the terminology here, but the point I'm emphasizing is that Shimomura is just as comfortable composing in typical Western major and minor scales, but also in modified versions of those scales, which is slightly more rare, particularly in video game music. I think it sets her work apart a little bit, and because she's able to explore these colors so seamlessly in much of her music, it's worthy of recognition and distinction, especially for how she's been able to do this with so many of her new tracks for Key. So why am I telling you about all this modal stuff? Well, I want you to briefly listen to Before the Daylight. If you're familiar with the piece, it may not be immediately obvious that the track is composed a little outside the traditional major scale system.
Capiche? Now, shall I elaborate?
For the more musically fluent, this track touches on Mixolydian in the way that it emphasizes that flat 7 G natural occasionally, with some additional modal mixture as well. We hear this in the melody as well as in the harmony later on, and not to get into any musical philosophy with why Mixolydian may have been compositionally chosen, but it's pretty common in modern media to write Celtic or even Nordic sounding music with usually either a focus on monophonic harmonies and traditional instrumentation, or, like Shimomura seemed to do, by experimenting with a relatively more uncommon musical system, like the Mixolydian mode. Not saying it's rare, just that modal composition of any kind is less common than the standard modes you may have learned in music class. Even composers like John Powell employed this exact kind of modal exploration in his Viking score for How to Train Your Dragon. Now, obviously, Shimomura probably didn't know about the ties to Norse mythology that would later come from Scala ad Caelum and Dark Road, But it's fun to imagine that this microscopic musical hint in at least the field theme of Daybreak Town might be just a crumb of indication that she could have been aware of the direction this world and the story would eventually take. I'm finished talking about Daybreak's field and battle tracks for now, but the musical ideas Shimomura used in composing these pieces are surprisingly emblematic of her work from throughout these games in general. For Key, it seems as though Shimomura's musical expression of the story centered around a much more nebulous compositional philosophy, instead of through the more concrete indicators that she's used before, like common instrumentation or leitmotif. Unlike the scores for all previous Kingdom Hearts titles, the unifying thread in her Key work was distinctively an exploration of keys of tonality. That is to say, most every track Shimomura composed here has 2 sections with 2 different pitch centers, which would be a remarkable coincidence if this weren't the case for so many tracks. I'd hesitate to say she did this specifically for plot reasons, but perhaps this is her way of musically implying that, for example, Daybreak and Scala are 2 sides of the same coin, or, more generally, that there exists some duality in the narrative. Not only
do you have your union.
Not only do these tracks share this dual tonality idea, but also most of the new pieces in this score are composed using some kind of modified 7th modality, like the Mixolydian Major, or as we'll talk about later, the Natural Harmonic Minor.
Could you get to the point?
Okay, cool. I know I'm getting a little nitty-gritty with the compositional details again, but it's cool. Again, probably a stretch to think Shimomura did all this with strictly a narrative purpose in mind, but I mean, we're talking like at least 4 tracks here, so I want to entertain the possibility of all this being intentional. Shimomura is always doing something to define her work specifically for each game she writes for, and it's so fun to knock on her head, dig around in the compositions, and uncover these little thought processes that seem to unify the score for these games, even if I may not have convinced you that there's a purpose to it. Let's move on before I start espousing any more harebrained music lore theories. The next couple of tracks are actually older pieces that were given a haircut and a nice wash for their appearance in Union Cross. Rest assured that these tracks won't require so much musical terminology to speak about them. Now, the Union Cross version of Dream Eaters plays for 2 instances in all of the Key games. First, in the Pet System introduction scene, where Chirithy concocts a creature in a flask for the player character, and similarly, it plays in back cover when the Master of Masters introduces a Spirit Chirithy to the Foretellers.
They're here to help, so play nice.
Okay.
For these reasons, just like in the Dream Drop soundtrack, I've classified the piece as a character theme for spirits. What's especially notable about this track is that it's a less version that Shimomura newly arranged for these stories, seemingly to keep the player focused on the cutscene dialogue rather than on any simultaneous sung vocal audio, which can make understanding written or spoken exposition difficult.
You're not a player, and my pack's with someone else.
Okay, so we can't be partners. Why don't I just help you out?
Ishimoto, why?
Years passed and we barely ever saw each other. Then, finally, it was time for her coronation.
Anna, I can't
Let's
hear
just
you.
say I was
Compared to the version of the track from DDD featuring the Suginami Junior Chorus Children's Choir, this change in the arrangement is
Indeed.
a welcome one. Shipmeister's Shanty is also slightly updated from its original appearance in KH2. For Unchained Key, this piece accompanies most of the menus, but when Unchained Key became Union Cross in early 2017, most of the game's main interface music underwent a serious overhaul. This not only resulted in the replacement of Dearly Beloved for the new Union Cross arrangement, but also the replacement of Shipmeister's Shanty for all the menu screens. With the update, Shipmeister's Shanty was actually completely scrubbed. It cannot be heard again anywhere else in the game.
Like I said, it's nowhere to be found.
In regards to the arrangement itself, we can't be sure who arranged the track since it's not included in any official album release, but it seems likely that Shimomura herself created the work, considering that she's credited for the similar sounding Union Cross version of Hand in Hand that replaces all the menu music later. Instrumentally, this version of Shipmeister's Shanty is given a much more stripped back layering scheme, meaning many elements that make up the piece, accompaniment, melody, percussion, etc., were largely removed or reduced in comparison to the original.
I get it.
Now, since this track is originally from KH2, it does contain a motif from that game's overworld map theme that's also replicated in this version of the piece. which does make me more relieved that the track gets replaced later to resolve this motif misuse. This will be a point in KH3's music analysis as well, but the statement of the KH2 overworld map theme in Shipmeister's Shanty pretty rigidly affixes the track to only KH2, and its reuse in any other game comes off as inappropriate, in my opinion. Luckily, Shimomura would create new music in her Union Cross arrangement of Hand in Hand, which differs from the KH1 version with its lighter instrumentation, but otherwise it's kept pretty structurally identical to the Traverse Town battle theme we all know and love. Now, I think the decision to use Hand in Hand rather than the KH2 Gummy Hanger music is probably an extension of Hand in Hand's common reuse throughout the series as a sort of the adventure continues kind of piece. And for that reason, I think it functionally works much better for all the Union Cross menu navigation, the equipment, avatar, and party screens, the shop, medal list, theater, and ultimately, it's also used for the offline mode menu that greets the player now that the game is offline. So speaking of menu music for Union Cross, Pixel Hero is a new Sekito track that accompanies the classic Kingdom minigames in the X-Trace mode. I won't sit here and say it's like a paragon of compositional might or anything, but it's interesting that this track, which is mostly associated with KH3's classic Kingdom in the Gummy Phone, was added to the mobile game before KH3's release, making Union Cross the first time a player could hear it. I always find the first instance of a new piece of music in the series pretty interesting, because it establishes the purpose of the piece, thereby giving players a basis for comparison if it ever becomes reused later. We'll continue barreling through the rest of Sekito's compositions now. He also wrote all the field and battle music for the various worlds connected to Wreck-It Ralph, the first of which is his game Central Station. This track has some of Sekito's clear instrumental indicators, the solo trumpet and brasses he's fond of using, as well as his affinity for combining high woodwinds and glockenspiel for melodies. As an aside, it's a fun exercise to try to identify his compositional tells in other pieces he's written for BBS and DDD. There's not a whole lot that's narratively or compositionally noteworthy with these Sekito tracks, all of which I think function fine in the context of Union Cross. The Candy-Filled Kingdom and The Fastest Racer are the field and battle tracks for Candy Kingdom. A Nameless Planet and Heroes Duty Troopers are the field and battle for Cybug Sector, and Welcome to Niceland and I'm Gonna Wreck It are the field battle for Niceland, which, on a personal note, I think are the best of the bunch. When Sekito composes with synthesizers instead of orchestra samples, he really excels in my opinion. One final observation we can make once the narrative in Union Cross accelerates to Niceland is that Rowdy Rumble stopped being used as the default music for Target Quest battles beyond this point. Sekito's Ralph battle themes take over, and honestly, it's such a relief to hear these tracks after about 800 missions ending with
When will it stop?
So now we have old Ishimoto's Twister Union Cross mix, which was newly arranged back in 2017 in celebration of the 10th anniversary of The World Ends With You. It's unique in that the track is used exclusively for the background music of the Illustrated Neku and The World Ends With You Art 2 medals in Union Cross. And don't worry, we'll be speaking about the other tracks used as background music for unique medals in due time. If you like The World Ends With You, this new arrangement will satisfy you, and at least it doesn't have any of the issues that plagued his DDD arrangement of Calling. It all works very nicely. My man sure loves his Twister. Might be fun to remix it myself sometime. I even found the samples he used. Alrighty. Hey folks, today we're going to be cooking up an absolutely delicious reconstruction of Twister from The World Ends With You. The first thing you want to go ahead and do is preheat your oven to 400 degrees, and while we wait for that, we can go ahead and find our Zero-G Guitar Odyssey sample pack, maybe navigate to loops, acoustic, and we'll check out the 2-bar A minor loop here. Yeah, so we'll go ahead and drag that into our song here. And let's say you wanted to add the finger-strummed version. Maybe you want to import this one. Cool. So let me just, for flavor's sake, go ahead and bump that down an octave. And let me adjust the volume so it's not awful. This is going to be the real basis for our meal here. But now that we have all those, we can keep browsing our zero-G samples, and let's look for something spicy. So I'm thinking we'll go to our horns, maybe navigate to the JB Soul riffs. You know, look around. No, we can't use that. Sorry, that's Dyson Shine from Birth by Sleep. We can't use that. Let's go to maybe 120 BPM because that matches our tempo. Ooh, that's pretty good. We'll go ahead and drag that one in. What's this sound like? Ooh, that's pretty good. And there's Twister. So we'll go ahead and drag both of those in just for kicks and giggles. Maybe we want to look at some various riffs. Maybe EWF 110. Ooh, that's loud and annoying. There it is. There's Twister. We'll drag that boy in. Pretty good. All right, now that we've got all that, flavoring is really getting there. Now we want to go ahead and sort of fold everything together. So we can close our browser for now, and we'll load up our FM8 synthesizer. I would normally turn on the piano here, but I don't think we need to concern ourselves with actually playing any notes, so you can go ahead and put that away if you've already got it out. So I'll go ahead and load up the presets, maybe the Crunch Crusher preset, and open the piano roll. That's going to be pretty good. I think that's Twister, so we'll go ahead and call that pattern 1. And we'll go ahead and put that right there. And just like Ishimoto, I will just take that and loop it for the entire song. Okay, but say you wanted to add some more presets from FM8. We can take a look at some other things that are in here. Let's check out Rock Baby, for example. No. We can't use that. That's calling. Let's check out the Land of Plenty. That's the B section from Twister. So we'll go ahead and we'll take that. We'll go ahead and put that in. Tube Thumper. Let me see what this sounds like. That's our boy. That's our boy right there. So we'll go ahead and layer him. We'll layer the Crunch Crusher, and we'll have the Land of Plenty. And yeah, I think that's all we're gonna be sticking with for our purposes. I think I just heard the oven beep. So let me go ahead and just quickly load up some vocal samples, and then we'll call this ready. Let's see what this sounds like. No, that's not vocals. That's Access the Grid from Dream Drop Distance. We can't use that. What's this? I'm sure I've got some vocals in here somewhere. No, that's not vocals either. That's something from Neo Tweewee. Can't use that. What about this? Oh, it's short. This must be vocals. Yeah. That's it. That's something. Let me load up another one. See what this is. A little bit louder. That's it. That's gonna be useful. I got one more thing. Let me just keep that there. I got one more thing to look at in my folder here. I wonder what this is. No. Sorry, we can't use construction kits yet, available for $4.99 from Ubershall, until we make Neo Tweewee, so we can't use that. No. So, with these, 8 samples here, I think we've got just about everything we're gonna need. All I'm gonna do is mix up what we've got, throw it in the blender, add some drums, some bass, and some record scratches, obviously, and I'll be back in a little bit to show you what we've made. Alrighty, hot out of the oven. So as you can see, I've got tons of record scratches down here. I've got some piano, some brass, the programmed drums, some bass, tons of rhythm guitar up here on everything blue. We've got our FM8 synthesizers, which I've made small. Go small, please. And we've got some incredible vocals by Lacey Johnson, who is absolutely killed it. So We did it.
Twist and moist with the resonance. Stick it up, step aside, see the world effects. That's effects, stick about to the moon. Where Psycho got a high kick, collect. Show me your best at crystals, blisters. It's all over now. Psycho game, so keen, I need more candy.
And there you go, folks. It's as simple as that. Stream it on Spotify. Thanks. Now, the track Scala ed Caelum is perhaps one of the most frequently occurring new tracks in these games, playing for a variety of event and ambient field scenes from back cover, as well as a great many of the Union Cross late-game dialogue scenes with the 5 new foretellers. Considering its uses all over Key and its initial debut in back cover for all the Case of the Foretellers chapters, the track's narrative behavior as a sort of catch-all event theme makes it a little difficult to understand how this piece contributes to the story. Before KH3 confirmed it even was a field theme, I had assumed this was a kind of character interaction track similar to Xemnas from Days, representing, like, the legacy of the Foretellers, or something to that effect.
There are traitors. Find them. You must find the traitor hidden among you, and stop them before it's too late.
But as far as I can tell for these games, the track is simply the usual default option for scenes involving Union leaders talking with one another, which, to some frustration, happens kind of a lot. If we can very briefly think about its composition, the piece is another of Shimomura's back cover tracks with 2 clear sections in C harmonic minor and F minor. Again, this observation of the 2 tonalities could seem to be relevant due to the sort of dual-world nature of Daybreak Town itself. Other than this, there's not much else that's compositionally striking in regard to relationships with other tracks in the series. It's pretty independent and will almost assuredly return to play in the future. One more of Shimomura's pieces, introduced in back cover, titled Passing the Power, seems to be mostly associated with Lushu. It plays as the Master of Masters bestowed to him the no-name Keyblade, later as Lushu sends the white-cloaked True Dandelion to the future with the lifeboat, and as the final scene in back cover, when Lushu walks through the desert, muttering the phrase,
"May my heart be my guiding key."
Now, I'm a little hesitant to call this Lushu's character theme, but the final use of Passing the Power in Union Cross for the game's post-credits, as Brain awakens in Scala ed Caelum, would hint at an interesting possibility. The implication of the scene, if Passing the Power is indeed a kind of secondary character theme or something, is that Brain and Lushu share a connection that's being relayed to the player. And the popular theory right now that Lushu has possessed some form of Brain at this point in time would seem to be supported by this musical decision. However, more likely, this track may just accompany events that follow a looking toward the future or rite of succession sort of function, and the use later in KH3 seems to support this observation more strongly.
Just watch.
In retrospect, Passing the Power is a lot like the Key of Light in terms of use. The Key of Light plays for many Ventus-related moments in BBS, but it just so happens that the track's purpose is more like light coming to the rescue. Similarly, Passing the Power accompanies many Lushu-related moments, but it just so happens that the track's purpose seems to be more for events that continue or preserve a lineage.
That means you've trained a worthy apprentice, passed down that handsome Keyblade, and fulfilled your role. Congratulations!
At least, this is my interpretation at the moment, but I'll leave you to speculate on what this track means and how it may be reused in the future for yourself. We're winding down now, and next up is the track Master of Masters, which is, for sure, the Master's theme. Shimomura actually spoke about its single use in back cover, saying that she was impressed with the aleatoric piano that was performed, I think, by Hiroyuki Nakayama. But don't quote me on that one. The official album credits 4 possible pianists. Notably about the track, it's yet another piece Shimomura wrote that was composed with 2 distinct tonal centers in mind for the track's 2 sections. It seems more and more that Shimomura's musical philosophy for back cover was intentionally linking all her tracks to one another under the common idea of having these tonally contrasting sections. It's really interesting, isn't it?
It's a little unnerving, to be honest.
Alright, Envy, well, initially, it seemed as though one of the other pieces from back cover was composed with the intention to be the Master's theme. Probably what would become Passing the Power, if I had to guess. But Shimomura noted in this interview that her new composition takes a direction that Kingdom Hearts music has never done before, and clearly what she meant was the non-melodic piano chaos over the track's 6 minutes. This kind of composing style seems to be gaining a little popularity these days. And it's great that composers are embracing this kind of experimentation in their scores. Imagine how funny the sheet music must have looked. If this track is to be an omen toward the musical future of the series, I think we might be safe in predicting more free-form, performer-dictated sorts of tracks like this, especially in scenes where the master is concerned. The piece, musically, seems to be devoid of motivic material connecting it to anything else in the series, but, I think this is for the best, as the franchise prepares to take off in what seems to be exciting new musical territory. And I gotta say that if I'm comparing this piece to Xehanort, Master of Masters wins by a landslide in capturing my attention, being as musically bold as it is. Speaking of character themes, the Foretellers might as well be classified as such, using the same logic as tracks like Organization 13 or even Villains of a Sort. Actually, Org 13 is a perfect piece with which to draw comparisons. One, both the Foretellers and Organization 13 are used to represent a group of characters. Two, both contain many strong musical fragments that are ripe for use as thematic material to be referenced or expanded. And most importantly, three, both are distinctly sectionalized very well, making the task of separating musical elements for use elsewhere pretty compositionally easy for Shimomura later down the line. If the music from this first arc of the Darkseeker saga is of any indication, we may expect to find many tracks in the future of the series that draw musical material from the Foretellers for battle and event music, in the same way that Another Side and Organization 13 were used to build most of the organization-related music from Chain of Memories, KH2, and onward. I wouldn't be surprised to hear this connectivity happening again in the series' future. Actually, I fully expect it.
It's anyone's guess right now.
The Foretellers makes itself fairly unique with its mixed meter and instrumentation choices. I can't think of too many other pieces in the series soundtrack that make use of harpsichord, a 14th century historical instrument that seems to evoke a sense of age. Other than maybe Dance of the Daring from KH2 for obvious reasons. The meter, though, is another point entirely. The track shifts from standard common time to duple 6/8, giving the piece a somewhat off-kilter sense of the pulse. Aside from all of this, the briefest of similarities seems to exist in the metric transition between the two sections of the Foretellers, seemingly a variation of a phrase that can also be found in Dastati. This is obviously to be taken with a pinch of skepticism, but specifically for this similarity, the role of the Foretellers as vessels of darkness could have been buried here in the music, due to Dastati's role in the series as the theme of darkness from throughout the Darkseeker saga, which we've talked about extensively before. The Foretellers, having this small similarity to Dastati, could musically imply this relationship between the Union leaders and darkness, which seems to have been confirmed by the Master in Union Cross and implied by Xehanort in KH3. Compositionally, it was interesting to me that Shimomura again ventures into modal exploration for the Foretellers. It's composed in the fairly common harmonic minor mode, but what made this observation noteworthy was how Shimomura seems to have explicitly modified only the 7th scale degree in this track. One could relate this to the story in that there are 7 Foretellers represented by Shimomura's music for key, but I want to be careful not to make a mountain out of a molehill here.
There's no way to tell.
All of these observations, though, from the frequent modulations in her tracks to the mixed meter sections in the Foretellers to the many examples of 7th-based modal composition, What all this seemed to imply was that Shimomura was intentionally defining the soundtrack of the Key experience with this idea of opposition and contrast. This is admittedly a shaky assumption, but it doesn't seem so far-fetched that all this musical thought was done intentionally when considering just how much subtlety she's been injecting into her music recently, and how much we've already found from her work in previous games. Alright, you want a motif chart? I'll give you a motif chart. Bam. These are all the themes in Key that are musically related to one another with what I thought was a sufficient amount of material to make it intentional. And like I mentioned before, the shared stuff is really just a bunch of obvious Dearly Beloved references. What's much more interesting though is really how these pieces use and transform the melody. Mission Complete and the fan-titled track Defeat are two Sekito stingers that play to indicate that some mission is either successfully or unsuccessfully finished. Mission Complete also plays at the end of each story quest, and both these tracks use Dearly Beloved as their primary melodic statement. Mission Complete is more direct, while Defeat is a variation that reverses the order of the lower notes. And now, the remaining tracks are just literally different versions of Dearly Beloved, composed specifically for each entry. We'll go through these in order. Dearly Beloved Unchained Key version, which is also the Key original arrangement, plays for the game's start page and the Daybreak Town hub, but it's also used for the game's movement and battle tutorial missions, the Mog Trade menu in original Key, the opening movie and back cover, and the Union Ranking Parade at the end of each week for Unchained Key. With the update to Union Cross, this arrangement was eventually phased out. The only way to still hear this older Dearly Beloved was in a scene from Tutorial Quest 3, or as background music from the HD Foreteller EX medals, which again we'll talk about more later. Instrumentally, the track strongly features toy piano and marimba in unison. In addition to the playful syncopation, the track seems to have been built with the express purpose of uniquely tying the piece to the Key kids and their arc through the first season of Key and Unchained Key's story. My impression of the arrangement is that it's childlike. It additionally accomplishes this with the piano, and how the tails of the main melody notes incorporate a musical embellishment of what seemed to be the tiny arpeggiation motif that tied together Before the Daylight and Wake Up World, and this is surely not coincidental. It's not a surprising observation to make that this track, like almost everything else for Key, is comprised of two very easily distinguishable sections in a way that other arrangements later down the line do not replicate. There's this track's soft and familiar section, followed by a new jaunty, upbeat segment, which plays right into this opposition idea that seems to define Shimomura's entire original score. Notably, this arrangement is also the first since KH1's to not quote Always on My Mind in any way. Shimomura was mistaken when she spoke about BBS being the first version without this musical statement, but her comment back then is still applicable to all these Key Saga arrangements, saying that she tried to express the timeline of the game with her arrangement. Now, in comparison to the older Unchained Key version, the newer Dearly Beloved Union Cross version takes more of a leisurely approach in the arrangement. Gone is the syncopation in the melody. It's replaced with soloists from the string and wind families, violin solo, oboe solo, and a cello solo too, all playing the unaltered melody. the marimba is still present in this version, the toy piano graduated to a full concert piano for this arrangement, playing a bit of a meandering line over harp accompaniment. It's interesting to listen to how Shimomura approached the evolution of this track for the new Union Cross launch. For back cover, Shimomura arranged yet another take on this melody, incorporating this idea of evolving the track between the titles. However, this one was orchestrated by Sachiko Miyano, who at this point should be a familiar name, having orchestrated so many pieces for the series up until now. Back cover maintains the piano prominently for most of the piece, simplifying the track in structure to be more similar to the modern Kingdom Hearts era arrangements in games like KH2 and BBS. The marimba from Unchained Key and Union Cross seems to be absent, and new to the track is an organ. And because the track is so much fuller, glockenspiel echoes can be heard over top, adding shimmer to places where it may have been difficult to make the melody clear in the mix. I don't want to speak too deeply about the production or orchestration of the track, but suffice it to say that back cover was given another evolved take on Dearly Beloved that, from a musical point of view, adds a little more depth to back cover's role as a sort of alternate story experience. Finally, Shimomura made one last Dearly Beloved arrangement for these games. It accompanies the credits of Union Cross, and was orchestrated by Natsumi Kamioka, another name we should be familiar with by now. As was hinted from all the previous Dearly Beloved arrangements for the different entries in this mini-arc, this final version seems to combine elements from the entire Key Saga into one huge piece. It starts with just the opening harp from the Unchained Key version, before a brief statement of, actually, the KH1 arrangement, which can be picked up by the dotted 8th rhythmic pattern and offset Glock in the highest register. After this momentary statement, it moves right into the Unchained Key version proper, picking up momentum with the gradual layering of instruments into the jaunty syncopated section from the same version. We can note here very quickly that there just seemed to be a similarity in the pedal point of the strings that mimic the back cover version. The transitional woodwinds between the sections sounded a little bit like an incorporation of the Forest Memory arrangement from KH3, and one might think this is coincidental, but this flourish will also appear later in the arrangement too. After this whole Unchained Key segment, the piano from the Union Cross version is layered over top the rhythm that's still chugging along. This part of the track is the truest combination of the mobile game versions that we will hear. Following this, those Forest Memory flourishes are given an open field to make themselves heard. The piece is simplified a little afterward, even taking a tempo deceleration in order to finish by growing into the KH3 arrangement. Just like the story narrative, Shimomura's musical narrative is also connecting the Key Saga to not only the Dark Seekers arc, but also to the series' future, with these tie-ins to KH1 and KH3 as well. This may be the first time different arrangements of Dearly Beloved have, themselves, been used as part of another Dearly Beloved arrangement, but of course this meta-textual integration is absolutely warranted for these stories, and is flawlessly executed by Kamioka's orchestration. It's just magnificent. So this has been every new track introduced in the 4 titles that make up the Key Saga. If you were just interested in learning how these originals help to accompany the story, what we've discussed up until now should more or less satisfy. That said, if I'm honest, the original score for Key mostly succeeded in only punctuating very few important scenes, while the many other reused tracks did most of the heavy lifting for general atmosphere building. In my opinion, it's mostly the game's many reused tracks that come to mind when we try to identify the true sound of these stories. The heavy reliance on the reused music is remarkable in how they accompany scenes in very appropriate and occasionally very questionable ways. I think now is the right time to start thinking about these reused tracks and taking stock of any notable musical differences between the shared scenes in the Key Saga. How these track differences affect the interpretation of a scene for each entry will become a point that can help to illuminate the overarching story, and the narrative direction the franchise seems to be taking much more clearly. Notable musical differences between shared scenes of the Key Saga. So it might come as a surprise, but on the whole, the Key games were pretty musically consistent. There are a few exceptions, of course, but I just wanted to highlight how dissimilar the Key Saga was to other re-release games, like Chain of Memories or Kingdom Hearts Coded. Upon porting those games to new consoles, the music implementation team would change many tracks, often to either make them more specific to whatever was happening, or to simply reduce fatigue. So new music changes were generally improvements to these older titles. However, this isn't really the case for Key.
That's why. I need to find out.
This track-changing paradigm that seemed to plague most every previous Kingdom Hearts re-release is largely absent, and so the Key games were unprecedentedly consistent with their music for shared scenes, which is very good. This all said though, Key hasn't yet been made into a singular consolidated story containing the narrative from every title. Because of this, there are many scenes that are actually unique to specific titles that don't exist in others. This makes understanding the music easier, but it also makes creating a timeline of all the events very difficult. In the end though, I was finally able to put together a comprehensive list that organized all the various flashbacks, dreams, and time skips that occur in these games. I've documented these into a spreadsheet that I can show you now. So take a look at this document that organizes all the music from the main narrative of each of these games and compares them to the other entries. The first column here lists all the events in a relatively sequential order. Sometimes these events may be highlighted with a light blue, indicating a key moment or some persisting element like a menu screen. Now, to the right of these events, I've also recorded the musical track that plays for each title along the row when applicable. Boxes that are blacked out are scenes that don't exist in that game, and therefore have no music. But more importantly, anything highlighted yellow will be tracks that differ from the other games, and these yellow highlighted tracks are going to be the focus of our examination. There aren't a lot of these musical discrepancies, but I think it's worthwhile to evaluate which music uses did change over the years, and the first notable difference between Key and Unchained Key is actually one of the first tasks of the game: building the player character. This happens just after Kairi's grandma reads the story that opens both games. Original Key makes the player customize an avatar and choose a union, while the first part of Dive into the Heart Destati plays. This is very conventional, almost routine at this point. Interestingly though, Unchained Key follows roughly the same sequence of events, with no music playing at all, just the user interface sound effects. This is honestly a little weird because the prompt to insert a name and customize your avatar interrupts the version of Dearly Beloved that had been playing. Dive into the Heart d'Astadi finally comes in with the reveal of the Station of Awakening, prompting the player to choose a union. The use of Dive into the Heart d'Astadi for the original Key scene is totally ordinary, but delaying the track until the reveal of the station in Unchained Key does come as a very slight narrative improvement in the way that it ties the piece just a little more strongly to events that directly involve the location. However, I do wish the game didn't just cut off the Dearly Beloved beforehand though. As far as I'm aware, this cut persisted with the update to Union Cross as well. Many of these musical differences between the titles will be in the tutorial segments of the games, and the next one is the scene where Chirithy describes Keyblades and the Heartless. Original Key accompanies this scene with the game's Dearly Beloved, which works great in context. Actually, Unchained Key will update this scene by first making the player go through a movement tutorial quest, and then following up with this Chirithy scene, accompanied by Before the Daylight. Unchained Key's new update in playing the field theme of the world is understandable. This will keep the game flow more consistent by separating the narrative from the title screen music. Events are already starting to happen a little out of order between the games, but there is an event where the player battles their first Shadow Heartless in Original Key to, again, that game's titular Dearly Beloved. Actually, most of the tutorializing used this track to ease the player into the game's mechanics. I mentioned before that Unchained Key makes the player go through a tutorial quest at the outset, and this quest is outfitted with all the usual pieces we would expect to hear. So Unchained Key's first Heartless battle, unsurprisingly, uses Daybreak Town's battle theme, Wake Up World. I do appreciate how much more seamlessly Unchained Key threw the player right into the game without needing to explain a ton of menus, unlike Original Key. There are still a lot of menus, but they're much more effectively integrated, and often with appropriate music to boot. So the last tutorial for the player involved raid battles. After the player's union leader explains that combining strength with others is the way to defeat larger enemies, a dark side emerges from a portal, and the mandatory raid boss tutorial starts. This is accompanied by Fragments of Sorrow for the entire battle in Original Key. This same scene occurs in Unchained Key as well, even including the brief Fragments of Sorrow. But during the actual fight, Destiny's Force newly plays instead. Now, for a long time, the species of raid boss would match with the music that would accompany the fight. But for Union Cross around 2018, the developers started changing some of these. Actually, a lot of the Heartless that had used Fragments of Sorrow started playing Destiny's Force instead, and vice versa. The development staff seems to conflate these two pieces, especially in regards to what should play during a Darkside fight. I applaud Original Key for using the track that played during Sora's first ever confrontation with the Darkside in KH1, but I think I prefer how Unchained Key more appropriately defines Darkside raid battles with Destiny's Force, which itself was used later in KH1 on the Crumbling Island. Both tracks are appropriate, but Fragments of Sorrow is less specific. It's more like a general Dive into the Heart battle theme. Compare this to fighting Darkseid in the real world, which has almost always used Destiny's Force. We've heard this track for Darksides in 0.2, Coded, and even 358 Days. I like the Destiny's Force update in Unchained Key much more than Fragments of Sorrow, which I think should be used more for events that directly concern the heart of a person or of worlds. Uses like these would keep it consistent with the previous games. For all the praise I can offer Unchained Key and updating the track, I do need to mention that I don't love the continual cutting off of cutscene music when battles begin in Unchained Key, even if it's to make events more standardized. We'll see that this frequent music cutting continues to occur for many moments adopted from the original game, unfortunately. Let's put this on hold for now. We'll talk more thoroughly about raid bosses and music cutting later. So, moving on, and for the sake of completeness, there is a scene that's kind of shared between Key, Unchained Key, Union Cross, and Back Cover, but it's told in a way that could be interpreted differently, and I hope you won't fault me for grouping all this together. All these titles share a scene where Chirithy elaborates about the Foretellers and the Book of Prophecies to the player as a kind of interstitial lore dump. Original Key and Unchained Key use Before the Daylight, since the scene occurs at the Daybreak Town Fountain. Meanwhile, for Back Cover, Passing the Power is continued from the previous scene where the Master of Masters had given Luxu his no-name Keyblade. This no-name scene is broken up and bookended in the movie, so I wouldn't expect the music to match the mobile stuff since there's an entirely different context here.
Long, long ago, all the worlds were still one. One day, this would be called the Age of Fairy Tales. It all began here in Daybreak Town.
For Union Cross, there is a very similar version of this scene for the Keyblade War event, which looks back upon events from Original Key and Unchained Key. Scala Edkylum plays while Chirithy questions whether the memories of the Key Kids were necessary to erase. Then, during the flashback, the Foretellers briefly plays until the scene concludes. It is interesting hearing the information about the Foretellers and the book from Chirithy in these many different ways. One as a sort of casual conversation, one as a personal reflection upon the past, and the last as more of a general narration to set up the events of the movie. I do wish Original Key and Unchained Key had played something a little more impactful for the moment than just the field theme, and I really do like how the Foretellers was used in the Keyblade War event for Union Cross, overriding the unremarkable use of Before the Daylight in the earlier games. As for Back Cover, the incorporation of Passing the Power to accompany Chirithy for the movie's establishing shots, that one I think is very effective in setting the tone for the cinematic. Okay, we skip forward several dozen quests and wind up at the end of Olympus. At this point in the story, player has been getting coached by Hades on using darkness. It was all an act though, the player was trying to rescue Hercules, and this all culminates to a battle against Hades at the smashed up Colosseum. In the scramble to find Herc, the field and battle themes of the world are replaced with Apprehension, originally from KH2. Finally, upon finding Herc and exiting the underworld, the player confronts Hades, who delivers a pre-battle monologue to the track Squirming Evil, originally from KH1. Nothing is different yet, but now, immediately as the battle begins, Original Key continues using Squirming Evil for the entire fight. The brief post-battle monologue before Hades retreats goes back to Apprehension, until the normal KH1 Olympus Coliseum field theme plays to indicate that the event is finished. Weirdly, this is all backwards in Unchained Key. Squirming Evil plays in the pre-battle confrontation, but the actual fight with Hades cuts in Apprehension until he's defeated. Then briefly during the post-battle monologue, Squirming Evil is cut in, before abruptly fading out to the normal Olympus Coliseum field theme. So, this might be the weirdest sequence of music in these games, and it makes me think that there was a programming error when taking Original Key and porting it to Unchained Key. I think the true sequence that was intended for this whole encounter was supposed to be the introduction of Squirming Evil when Hades powers up and the fight begins, and also continuing Squirming Evil until he disappears afterwards. With this hypothesis, Original Key gets the closest. What I think happened though was that Unchained Key programming for this quest might have defaulted to using Apprehension for both the field and battle, which consequently and laughably treats Hades as just another generic enemy. I assume there is some oversight in not programming boss music here. It's not a big deal, but it is a notable difference between these scenes, especially considering that this is the first real deviation outside the tutorial quests. Let's go back to Daybreak Town. The next shared scene is a little easier to talk about. Later in the story, Ava and Ephemer speak with one another at the Daybreak Town fountain. In the mobile games, the track used is simply the field theme before the daylight, and this plays even up until the logo drop that concludes the scene. However, this event also occurs in back cover, but the music used here is the KH 1.5 recording of Friends in My Heart.
Why the long face? Did something happen?
Long day. Do you remember what you asked me before? About why the unions compete against each other instead of working together.
Sorry. I think it's interesting that back cover would change, or maybe just clarify, the focus of the scene by replacing the music here. In the mobile games, there's not a whole lot of musical emphasis put on this scene in particular by just using the field theme. But in the movie, Ephemer comforting Ava and talking about his plan to see the player while Friends in My Heart plays is already reinforcing Ephemer's motives and his commitment to meet up in the following day. As we know, this meetup ultimately didn't happen, but Friends in My Heart here in back cover alerts the viewer that we shouldn't suspect anything nefarious from Ephemer later breaking his promise. Regardless of whether or not this musical decision will lead to some fun subverted expectations later down the line, spoilers, it doesn't, the track's use still adds an interesting wrinkle to the character. Additionally, the track also somewhat complements Ava's struggle at the moment. She's trying to come to terms with all the infighting among her peers, and speaking with Ephemer seems to reassure her that things will eventually work out as long as she believes in her mission. This track playing here subtly emphasizes her hope in a way that simply playing Before the Daylight could never match. We've also talked before about Dearly Beloved and its motivic association to light within the series, and because of this connection, the Dearly Beloved statement within Friends in My Heart also supports this idea that Ava's dandelions, which include Ephemer, are the light that will persist once war comes. It's descriptive in this way. In the end, I do appreciate back cover's musical decision to replace Before the Daylight to give this moment an enormous amount of narrative weight. I really can't think of a more appropriate replacement track. Now, there is another fountain scene with Ava and the rest of her dandelions later on. Both Original Key and Unchained Key feature scenes where Ava asserts that there will be war, and she needs her pupils to flee to the outside world. There's no music that plays here in the mobile games, which is odd considering how important the dandelions are for preserving the light. I'd think this moment would need to be emphasized, right? Back cover, though, will use the track Link to All during Ava's speech.
You are our hope. A war will soon wage. Those who strive to protect the light will turn their weapons on their allies for the sake of loyalty to their own unions.
This, at least, resolves my issue in there being no music during the Key games, but I actually don't think Link to All is quite appropriate. I don't want Link to All to wind up as overused as Rowdy Rumble, but it seems like we might be headed down that path. The track, like Friends in My Heart, does make use of the Dearly Beloved motif, and this musical association to light must have been one of the reasons it was chosen for the scene. However, I think I might have recommended something less victorious while still maintaining this association, something like Beyond the Door from KH1, or maybe even the later section from Passing the Power would have been really interesting narrative alterations. This might be subjective though, I'll leave it to you to make your own musical evaluation of the scene. So directly after this Dandelion scene, there is another musical discrepancy in Agrabah between Original Key and Unchained Key for the Rescuing Abu quest line. Player and Aladdin storm a cave, decimating anything in their path in search of the monkey, and eventually they confront the wily bandit Heartless that kidnapped him. In Original Key, this event is kind of musically played up to be a big finale. Shrouding Dark Cloud plays for the confrontation and subsequent battle of the enemy. But like with the Hades sequence we talked about before, I think the musical programming of Unchained Key led to some strange inconsistencies. For the mobile game, Shrouding Dark Cloud does play in the initial cutscene confrontation, but after this, the game updates the quest and gives back player control to initiate the battle, while the normal field theme, A Day in Agrabah, plays. This cuts off Shrouding Dark Cloud. When the battle actually begins, the track used is just the standard Target Quest battle theme, Rowdy Rumble. Okay, so all these interruptions do make sense considering the game's programming, like default field theme plays X, target quest plays Y, cutscenes are pre-baked with track Z, whatever. But this whole event, like the previous Hades battle, does a lot to take the player out of the game, and robs the player of any sort of musical climax during the event. Definitely the way Original Key handled this whole wily bandit confrontation, in my opinion, is miles superior for keeping the game flow steady. Now, the credits for these games also deserve some inspection, specifically with the music that was chosen. I know we just skipped a lot of the story, but actually, following Agrabah, there are no more shared scenes with musical differences. Kind of crazy, right? Let's address these credits one at a time. Original Key's credits occur after Ephemer and Skuld find the player collapsed after the Great Battle at the Badlands. We know the story continues after this, but here is where Original Key ends, and the credits that directly follow play Cavern of Remembrance, and then following this, Another Side. Let's sit on this for just a second. These are very interesting choices for a couple of different reasons. Cavern of Remembrance is a track that only plays for 2 events in the whole Key saga, these credits, and also the splash screen / title drop intro of Union Cross, and notably not Unchained Key. I actually like this one a lot. Not only does the track imply that the finale we just experienced was like a lost memory in the grander scope of the story, which it was, but from a metagame perspective, it also eases the lead into the new story arc from Union Cross, and how this same track plays while the game loads the start screen. It's a great bit of musical consistency, linking together the end of Key and the beginning of what comes after, effectively connecting the 2 story arcs of these games. The track that follows is Another Side, and this is more strange. The track had been used in the past for a KH1 post-credits sequence, so it makes some sense on a surface level, but I don't really like how lazy this decision seems. I almost wish that the continuation of Cavern of Remembrance, or even the game's Dearly Beloved, had been used instead. It's really strange to hear the track that gave birth to Organization 13, when the game really has nothing to do with the organization at all. So okay, next up is Back Cover, and the credits music for this cinematic are also pretty bonkers. The first track is unsurprisingly Another Side, and for all the reasons I just mentioned, this track still feels very inappropriate here. I think it's clear that the music implementation team for this movie wanted a piece of music that maybe was more climactic sounding and not so much musically relevant to what the audience just experienced. I really think that for both Original Key and Back Cover, that even using something like The Foretellers or just Dearly Beloved would have been much more appropriate. I will give some kudos though that the implementation team had the foresight to use the same music for both of these. I still think it's an inappropriate choice, but at least it's consistently inappropriate. Back Cover does play a second track after this though. It plays Roxas's battle theme, The Other Promise, which again makes absolutely no sense. Roxas has nothing to do with literally anything that happens in any of these stories, so I don't know what's going on. It just comes across as though the team didn't really give a whole lot of thought to these decisions, like these tracks were decided by the roll of a dice. I mean, maybe Roxas has some crazy hidden connection to the Foretellers. Or maybe whoever put together this credits sequence just thought The Other Promise sounded nice for an audience send-off. It is pretty neat though that the track has an ending chord that we've never heard before. So, whatever.
Wow.
To end on a more positive note though, Union Cross does accompany its credits sequence with a unique arrangement of Dearly Beloved, which we've already talked about. This track effectively wraps together the entire Key saga and connects these stories to the rest of the series' Darkseeker arc with an enthusiasm that only Shimomura and her collaborators seem capable of. Union Cross has, without question, the most musically effective credits of any of these titles. Okay, the final musical deviation between these titles is the scene as Luxu and the Black Box make their way through the desert. This scene concludes Back Cover, and Luxu mutters,
"May my heart be my guiding key,"
while Passing the Power accompanies. For the Union Cross post-credits, it seems as though this scene was slightly extended and the track replaced with Scala ad Caelum. To be honest, I don't know for certain if these two scenes are supposed to be one and the same. I mean, it seems like many folks believe they are, but I'm thrown off by the cloaked figure mixing up the pronouns, saying, "May my heart be my guiding key" in one, and "May your heart be your guiding key" in the other. The Kingdom Hearts localization team is usually so careful about this kind of thing.
I don't know what to make of it, to be honest.
Right, and I'm also thrown off by these two scenes not using the same music. We've been talking a lot about the musical differences between these titles, but please don't misunderstand. A huge majority of the shared events in these games changed nothing musically. This musical discrepancy is a big deal because every other series of ports or re-releases in Kingdom Hearts would usually change so much of the music. This resulted in there being a definitive version of these games to play, with definitive scenes using definitive music to accompany. Over the course of 8 years, to have so much musical cohesion that I only found 11 small discrepancies throughout the Key saga is a real testament to the music implementation team's attention to detail and their attention to consistency. I made it a point to emphasize how strictly these games' musical choices for shared scenes adhered to one another at the start, so it's striking that this very important narrative moment does not share the same music. It doesn't even use related tracks. It's possible that matching the music and dialogue weren't made priorities, but I don't know.
What's the meaning of this?
In Back Cover, the implication of Passing the Power is that the cloaked figure is indeed Luxu, and that he's off to complete his role as given by the Master, watching the fall of Daybreak Town and finding a successor. In Union Cross, the implication of Scala ad Caelum playing for what looks like Brain is a little less clear just by virtue of the track being kind of poorly defined already, but I do associate the track more strongly to events where Union leaders are involved, whether that be the Master telling the Foretellers their role in the case of the Foretellers chapters, or the new Union leaders coming up with some plan together. In the case here, this track is kind of just showing where Lauriam, Elrona, Brain, Ephemer, and Ven wound up after their respective lifeboat trips, so Union Cross music here seems less specific, taking on much more of a background role to what's being actually shown on screen. Interestingly, and this is the last thing I'll say about all this, passing the power is used in the very next scene when Brain seems to have awakened in the world Scala ad Caelum. Kind of interesting that the field theme of the world wasn't used here. Almost seems like the tracks for Union Cross post-credits are backwards.
That's highly unlikely.
I mean, Ira, like, this is kind of suspicious, isn't it? I can't say for certain if this is just a symptom of rush programming or some intentional choice, obviously, but I hope I've at least demonstrated that the track order here is weird. So, these were the scenes shared by the key games that were notable in how they used different pieces of music to express similar narrative beats. Often these differences seem to occur due to each game's programming priorities. Original Key often had more seamless cutscene to gameplay sequences, like in the case of the Hades and Wily Bandit fights. But with the transition to mobile phones, Unchained Key, and later Union Cross, seemed to have stricter music rules, where field, battle, and event tracks would be implemented with less of a regard to the game flow or thematic relevance. A few of the pre-baked cutscenes with music would occasionally result in some jarring auditory transitions. On the whole though, the logic behind which track would play, and why, was usually easy to understand. And for that reason, the music in the Key Saga is forgivably clear in how it assists the main narrative in these titles, despite there being a few tiny discrepancies. Now, we've admittedly been somewhat broad when talking about these musical differences up until now, only really talking about narrative scenes where music changed. I've been kind of beating around the bush and making sure we're all on the same page with the music in the Key storyline, but it's finally time to actually, dig into the nitty-gritty of the more wackadoo music decisions for bosses, medals, specific cutscenes, and all that fun stuff regarding unique music in each title. What's most interesting about the more creative uses of some of these non-narrative track inclusions is how the different gameplay elements can use music in unexpected ways to celebrate how varied and diverse the series' soundtrack has become in the last 20 years. We'll take a short intermission now, and I'll present part 3 afterward.
How's about a change?
Thanks so much for listening to our cover of Rowdy Rumble. Let's continue talking about the music of Kingdom Hearts, Key, in part 3. Addressing specific musical decisions within the Key Saga. Okay, so now finally I get to share all the weirdo tracks that can be found in the various Key games. Like, look at this. What's with all the Final Fantasy Legacy stuff? Who invited you? Oh, and look here, we've got like 2 versions of Shion's theme, 2 Kairi's, 2 versions of The Other Promise. What else? Oh, what's with all the Cage 3 music here? So, aside from the main story, the Key titles had many significant moments where some tracks would flat out not be used in the same way that they had in the past. Usually these differences were just a creative decision that wouldn't really impact the narrative. However, these music choices are nonetheless unique to the games they occur in, and they help to shape how these games are remembered. Considering this, there's a lot to talk about that makes Key kind of a giant celebration of the series' music, and also of the music from other Square Enix properties. By now, we've addressed most of the plot-relevant tracks in the Key Saga, so I just want to start to wind down and take account of some surprising uses, anything that caught my attention for being kind of unexpected. These will be relatively brief and easy to speak about.
Easy breezy.
Alright.
And here, we should start by addressing the elephant in the room, which is how Union Cross uniquely had a whole slew of medals that were special enough to get their own background music when highlighted. All in all, there were 37 medals with this special designation, all released around the same time period. The practice of adding background music to new medal releases suddenly stopped, though, after Supernova Sephiroth in June 2018. This was the last one. What made these medals even more special was that if you were to share a musical medal in Union Cross, that unique music track would play at the Daybreak Town Fountain hub until the medal is unshared. This, I think, is an awesome way of being able to listen to some of the great arrangements this series has received from outside the games. Some of the tracks that caught my attention were the Kingdom Hearts World Tour arrangement of Daybreak Town, which was included with Orchestra Sora, not to mention the several Piano Collections arrangements of various character themes. Even tracks like Twister Union Cross Mix were actually uniquely made for the 2 The World Ends With You medals. It's an interesting assortment of chosen tracks, and it's a real shame that the music medals stopped being released. These were, maybe predictably, some of my favorites. Alright, next up, maybe we should talk about all the Final Fantasy music. So, obviously, Nobuo Uematsu's One-Winged Angel from Final Fantasy VII accompanied all the music medals featuring Sephiroth. But the track is also, unsurprisingly, used for the climax of the Dark Winged Warrior event, as well as many Sephiroth Challenge and special Versus Sephiroth events in Union Cross. This track has played many times previously in the series, but it may also be interesting to learn that there were other Final Fantasy-inspired Heartless events with legacy music. Dancing Mad from Final Fantasy VI, for example, was used during a Final Fantasy Record Keeper collaboration event in 2018 against the mysterious Sir Emblem Heartless. I won't claim to know much about this music, but the 4-movement piece had originally been used in the game's last boss battle against Kefka's final form, and it returns here in its original arrangement for the Heartless based off the enemy. Additionally, the original version of Clash on the Big Bridge from Final Fantasy V was used for another Record Keeper event against the Weapon Master Emblem Heartless, a design inspired by Gilgamesh. Again, I'm not super knowledgeable on Final Fantasy music in particular.
That is not our mission.
Right, Ira, we study Kingdom Hearts, but from what I understand, this is a recurring theme over various Final Fantasy games, of which arrangements can be found in Final Fantasy XII, XIII-2, XIV, XV, Dissidia, and almost certainly many others. I like all these legacy Final Fantasy track inclusions a lot. The choice to reuse these older themes in a Kingdom Hearts game exposes players to Uematsu's compositional work and shows that Square Enix recognizes the Kingdom Hearts brand as a meaningful one, with which they can promote their other franchises. So these special collaboration events were often accompanied by interesting non-Kingdom Hearts tracks, but other events with noteworthy music included many raid boss battles, whose auditory diversity is kind of staggering. For many of these raid bosses with unusual music, I've been largely unable to find presentable footage.
What proof do you have?
The only proof that these tracks were used for these battles mostly comes from scoured research on various forums, the KHUX Wiki, GameFAQs, Reddit, etc. However, these fights with the special tracks are important to take account of, so we're aware of how these pieces could get reused in the future, too. And I mean, there's everything from Battleship Bravery for the Gummy Hound to Spooks of Halloween Town for Hocus Pocus and Original Key, and these are only some of the one-off special raid bosses. It was actually more common to use a piece of music for raid bosses of the same species. Those with a similar design theme would often use the same music. The Encounter, for example, was used for many aquatic raid bosses, including Trident Tail, Submarine Carp, and Shipwreck Shark battles. The Deep End may have been one of the most frequently occurring tracks in Unchained Keys raid boss battles, just playing for a litany of Omega variant, animal, and insect-based Heartless. Kinda wish they flipped these two to maintain the water theming, but whatever. Now, there are many more pieces used for raid bosses throughout the Key Saga, but it can sometimes be very hard to identify the logic behind some of these other choices, and most of them aren't really surprising. So if you're interested in looking at any specific music for these kinds of fights, I've also documented all this in the spreadsheet that you can access in the video description. So with some of the late game quests in Union Cross, it was quite surprising to me that the music implementation team actually used some tracks from Kingdom Hearts 3. This is unusual, but maybe expected since there's precedent. Recall that the recoded cinematic in 2.5 also used a piece of music from Dream Drop Distance, a game that had come out well after Coded's story was finished. For Union Cross, the tracks Little Lovely Moments, Eye of the Storm, and Titanic Clash were mostly used for Wreck-It Ralph cutscenes, starting with Quest 930. These tracks' uses are generally okay, but it seems pretty clear that they weren't chosen to lend any special narrative weight to the scenes they accompany. Little Lovely Moments behaves in KH3 like BBS's Peaceful Hearts, or Lapache from Chain of Memories, or Ever After from Dream Drop Distance, so it was notable that the many later scenes in Union Cross didn't use these older tracks, instead choosing to use the much newer piece that functions similarly. All that said, Little Lovely Moments still works great, and even Eye of the Storm is used pretty well. It's been defined as a Disney villain battle theme in KH3, and having it play for the King Candy Showdowns is fairly appropriate. I think I understand the desire to change up the musical palette a little bit at the cost of some internal consistency within Union Cross. I like how these two pieces are used. Titanic Clash, though, is a fair bit weirder in terms of its single use in Union Cross. This track's purpose seems to have been intended for battle against a colossal enemy, as defined in KH3 against the Titans and the Kraken. The Nightmare Cybug using Titanic Clash seems like it's just a little bit inconsistent. I wouldn't call the Cybug a particularly large enemy, it's even smaller than some of the generic raid bosses. But more than this, there are other tracks that would fit for this fight in a much more descriptive manner. Tracks like The Dread of Night, or Night of Fate. Or heck, even Anger Unchained if you wanted to use something from KH3. All these have been used for Nightmare, Darkling, and Darkness-influenced battles in the past. And so in the end, it feels as though Titanic Clash is kind of the odd one out with the KH3 reuses, but I do acknowledge the attempt to inject some musical diversity into the finale. I just wish there was a little more thought put into the Nightmare Cybug battle. Now, changing gears really quick, it's a pretty common sentiment that Agrabah burnout among Kingdom Hearts fans reached an all-time high with Union Cross's seemingly endless desert missions. But Agrabah also had a lot of interesting uses of music that caught my attention. One sort of less notable observation comes from the scene as Prince Ali seeks an audience with the Sultan, and the battle theme Arabian Dream is used to accompany the benign conversation. This is just clearly a mistake that should have been the field theme, A Day in Agrabah, I think.
You're saying he was wrong?
Yeah, Envy. Mistakes happen, no big deal. But additionally, the Cave of Wonders got a lot of first-use music that is newly introduced in the game for this series of missions around Quest 760. Tracks like KH2's Hesitation and KH1's No Time to Think appear for the first time in the game here. Even the rare Desire for All That Is Lost is used just like it had been in KH2 against the Blizzard and Volcanic Lord Heartless. It seemed like the scenario writing team wanted to build up Agrabah with some special music to help it stand out.
That was foolish.
Ased gets grumpy when he thinks about Agrabah, and I can't really blame him. But the soundscape of the world is, I think, one of the most musically diverse locations in Key, which is remarkable. So, target quest battles, huh? Original Key's quest targets actually used the track Destiny's Force, while Unchained Key and Union Cross replaced this with Rowdy Rumble instead. Because we'll be hearing these pieces of music over the course of literally hundreds of quests, they will inevitably become tiresome. It's kind of interesting that these particular choices were made, though. I think Destiny's Force is an appropriately nostalgic and befitting track for the end of a quest. Its original purpose in KH1 was for early game boss battles, so it always felt like the last fight of any quest was a conclusive moment in Original Key. On the flip side, if I never hear Rowdy Rumble again, I'll be grateful. This track has had its purpose changed so many times over the course of the entire Kingdom Hearts series that it's just default generic battle music at this point. It sounds cool, I like everything about the composition, it's just become extremely confusing due to being overused since 2006, through no fault of Shimomura, of course. I'll talk a little more about Rowdy Rumble, specifically in a moment. There were also some musical changes concerning the user interface, but like who cares about the UI, right?
Minor details, so don't sweat it.
No, listen, like Keyblade upgrade, deck building, and card draw or metal pull menu screens all had a bunch of different tracks between the titles, and this was kind of strange to me.
For what reason?
Yeah, Ased gets it. Like, why? These games seem to treat these menus similarly to how the Gummy Ship menu prepared Sora to set off into a world, and for this reason, Shipmeister's Humoresque from KH1 was used for these menus in Original Key. This does get updated, somewhat understandably, for Unchained Key, which used the KH2 Gummy Ship building music, Shipmeister's Shanty. We've already talked about why the motivic material in the Shipmeister's tracks make them inappropriate, and like I mentioned previously, Union Cross thankfully did away with the entire Gummy Ship association of these screens. Now, I suppose Original Key didn't consider building and outfitting a character as part of the preparations to continue with the story, so no Shipmeister's Humoresque here. Original Key actually used that game's dearly beloved for character customization. Unchained Key and Union Cross continued to treat all their menus the same. Shipmeister's Shanty played in Unchained Key, and Hand in Hand played in Union Cross, as expected. I appreciate this eventual consolidation in the mobile ports. It makes it easier for me and for the player to understand what these tracks are doing and what their function was for these games. Lastly here, Precious Stars in the Sky was used in Original Key, Unchained Key, and Union Cross for the quest selection screen. I did say before that Union Cross largely did away with the Gummy Ship music, but I suppose I haven't really accounted for this vestigial track until now. In the same way that Kingdom Hearts Coded used this piece for world selection, the track can be granted a certain amount of leniency here. I'd obviously prefer if every game got its own sort of choosing a world music, but seeing as Key is kind of a celebration of the series already, and that there's precedent for Precious Stars in the Sky, I think it might have been the obvious choice here. So to quickly summarize, in the older Key games, menus designed for preparing to do a quest, like equipment and shopping, got Gummy Ship preparation music. Eventually, the music decisions were slowly taken over in Union Cross to Hand in Hand for everything, except for Precious Stars in the Sky, which remains the same as it always has. So I guess now we can just make some final rapid-fire observations for some of the pieces that caught my attention as we go through the comments in this spreadsheet. This first bundle of tracks are specific uses that I thought were either ineffective or maybe misprogrammed, which may be interesting for you to judge for yourself. I'll do my best to make a strong case against each when I can. So, Memories in Pieces. Remember this one?
You didn't forget, did you?
This is the very first track that plays in the game, and if you'll recall, this is also the piece of music that played for the opening of Kingdom Hearts Chain of Memories. Even if you didn't remember the title, you probably recognize that this track is actually a medley of 4 important pieces for that game. As such, I wanted to point out that I think the track is auditorily nice to listen to, but in my opinion, it's thematically completely inappropriate for Key. I mean, the medley quotes Naminé's theme, as well as Castle Oblivion. I don't need to tell you that these two have nothing whatsoever to do with the Key saga. I mean, I guess I appreciate the attempt to repurpose this older track, because it's really nicely arranged, but this is the first scene of the game. To already use an older theme with such a blatant disregard to Shimomura's story in the music feels a little bad. I'm thankful the rest of the game is pretty musically competent, but this was kind of a mediocre first impression from a narrative point of view. Next here, Olympus Coliseum music is usually pretty normal in these games, for the most part. The KH1 version of the field theme plays appropriately for all the overworld field exploration, KH2's The Underworld plays for all the underworld field exploration, and the appropriate battle tracks Go For It and What Lies Beneath play for general mob battles in each, respectively. Go For It is also used for the Coliseum PvE and PvP battles, which is perfect. What was weird though is that the old barrel training track, Road to a Hero, also occurs in these games, but again, not in Olympus. It's actually used in Quest 898 when Wreck-It Ralph gets the Cybug medal. Road to a Hero only showed up this once, but just like in Dream Drop Distance, it's used here in a scene outside of Olympus Coliseum and completely unrelated to it. Okay, do I need to knock on the music team's front door to tell them that Road to a Hero isn't literally a doing something heroic theme? Because it's very jarring every single time it plays for this sort of purpose. I hope I'm not alone in feeling this way. I know that because it accompanied the barrel exercise in KH1, it can be understood as like a training or leveling up kind of track, but I just don't understand the hesitancy in simply using Cheers for the Brave, which has the exact same function, but also has no associations to any specific location. Unlike Road to a Hero, which is literally a sped up arrangement of the Olympus Coliseum field theme. It doesn't work outside of Olympus. We'll also see that this track is used later in KH3 for an unrelated purpose as well. So unfortunately, here's another piece, like Rowdy Rumble, that's kind of lost its original function. F in chat. Oh man, you must be sick of me talking about Rowdy Rumble so much, but believe me that I'm also tired of having to refer to it as much as I have.
It's finally come to this.
To its credit, there are a few unique moments in how this track was used throughout these games, but I do also just want to spend a second to clarify why I'm so over this piece. I'll start by addressing what I think were effective uses of the track. I liked how it was used as a callback to BBS for the Lucifer chase in Union Cross. That was an appreciated reference to how the track had been used for the Ventus battle versus the cat.
Time to play, cat! Take the pearl, Jack. I'll hold them off. Run!
It's also interesting that this piece was used specially for Alice's trial verdict from back in Original Key. Since Union Cross uses the track all the time for target quest battles, it kind of devalues the use for the stacked cards battle in Wonderland, but I do like it here. Other specific uses, though, are much less impressive. The huge snowman battle in Beast Castle feels like the event is kind of a joke, even though this is a formidable enemy. or it's supposed to be anyway. I would have expected something more impactful, like Desire for All That Is Lost, which was used for all the big battles in this world, against enemies like the Enraged Elk, and even continuing for Beast vs. Gaston. I also think that if you're going to have a recurring theme for some specific function, like
the end of every quest,
you should consider splitting up the narrative responsibilities of the music and give big battles different pieces. Otherwise, the music's just going to become a parody of itself. I just really can't take the piece seriously anymore because I'm never sure if it's trying to be a Pete theme, a gimmick fight, a mob battle, an unversed battle, a world landing battle. Speaking of overused themes, Strange Whispers, huh? Wow. So, this track is used for like 90% of the dialogue in Union Cross. This is an exaggeration, but obviously, you know, so much use destroys any kind of nuance the track has in clarifying narrative scenes. Not everything it's used for will be related, and so the player's just gonna not engage with the music, tuning it out in favor of reading a text box. Specifically, many of the more bizarre uses involve Cinderella's stepmom, of all characters, and rather than using villains of a sort for these interactions, the mystery theme Strange Whispers was generally defaulted to instead. Strange Whispers does contain the darkness motif from Dastati, which we've talked about before. And so I do like many of the plays in the Union Cross late game for conversations with the character, Darkness. But I don't think it's an unpopular sentiment that the piece was pretty overused for events that don't necessarily require it.
I'm sorry?
We've got well over 300 pieces in the Kingdom Hearts soundtrack at this point, and I don't think it's unreasonable to find music that actually adds something to the more narratively consequential scenes. The only other older track that compares to Strange Whispers in number of occurrences is Scent of Silence, originally from Chain of Memories. This track's primary function in that game was as a remorse theme, and it's very short. Recall that this track is medleyed in Memories and Pieces, and that it essentially defined the secrets motif that I spoke about in the Chain of Memories analysis. Scent of Silence really owes its revival to the Key series, where it's become kind of a field theme for the Foreteller's Room and conversations with the Union leaders. After not really being heard since COM, that cover used the piece many times before any of the instances in Union Cross, and anyone who's played through the mobile game will immediately recognize it. Admittedly, I can't say for certain what its function is in these games because this piece, alongside Strange Whispers, seems to be one of the default options for the music implementation team when building scenarios. However, I would hazard a guess that both these tracks seem intended to complement the games as mystery themes, especially since the Key narrative seems firmly footed into the mystery genre itself. If you'd like to read through the events where these pieces play and draw your own conclusions for what they specifically represent, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts.
Have you learned something?
Yeah, let Ira and me know if you learned anything. Moving on now, the use of Peaceful Hearts, originally from BBS, isn't bad, but I think that over the years it became a little confusing. Recall that this track has typically been used as an event theme for the happy conclusion of a Disney World, or at the very least some kind of resolution. This track, as well as Ever After from DDD, was still largely used for this purpose in Original Key and Unchained Key, too. What's interesting is that the piece also functions as the Castle of Dreams field theme for the Union Cross continuation of the story, replacing Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo from how the world had been musically represented back in BBS.
Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo!
I can't say for certain what prompted the change, but I imagine that to save money on music licensing, these scenario writers might have preferred to use a Shimomura original. Other interesting uses in Union Cross notably include a missable extended cutscene. If the player character is female presenting, the Duke will actually ask the Key Kid to try on the glass slipper, which doesn't happen otherwise. The track also plays for Original Keys post-credits as well, a scene titled Unchained Zero, where the player awakens in a projected data-enchanted dominion after Chirithy erased their memories. So now, kind of for the first time ever, we have a track that's both an event theme as well as a field theme. Peaceful Hearts is doing quite a lot of the heavy lifting for the Key Saga, but it's really neat to hear it used for so many different purposes. Now, though, I think Peaceful Hearts should just take over forever and become the de facto Castle of Dreams field theme so that Ever After and other resolution tracks can be made more distinct for the future of the series.
We have to focus on what comes after.
If we don't hear Peaceful Hearts for anything other than Castle of Dreams from here on out, I'll be very happy. From one field theme to another, it may be surprising to learn that the old KH2 track, Lazy Afternoons, occurs once in Union Cross during a 2018 summer adventure quest. After their mission, the sewer crew meet up at the Daybreak Town hilltop at sunset and eat ice cream together. After the scene finishes, the player is rewarded with a special outfit, an Organization 13 coat, holding a sea salt ice cream. Recall that this track is the field theme for Roxas's Twilight Town, and that it played for Sora's visit in Chain of Memories. And so it's clear what the intention of using this track here was, to call back to Roxas's routine of hanging out with his friends in the opening of KH2. This is fine, and quite charming, honestly. I think a lot of people really appreciated hearing this piece again here. However, I do want to be just a little annoying and point out that A, this isn't Twilight Town, and B, we already have an ice cream hangout theme. At dusk I will think of you from Days. As a matter of fact, Shimomura literally said as much in an interview from that game. And so, I think that to be perfectly consistent, I might have preferred this older theme returning rather than the Chain of Memories and KH2 one, but granted that this is a nitpick. I also understand that this entire optional event is, for all intents and purposes, a parallel to the opening of KH2.
Homework?
And for that reason, the decision to use Lazy Afternoons here may be better to further these parallels. In my estimation, field themes and battle themes are the default options for any scene in a Kingdom Hearts game. Using a track that's been defined as an event theme will generally be more difficult, but if it's applicable, an event theme will usually be more specific to the scene. They should be employed basically whenever possible. These are high priority tracks. However, players will probably be more familiar with Lazy Afternoons than At Dusk, and so to hit the nostalgia for as many folks as possible, the decision does make sense. But now, I think Key has earned its time in the limelight. And so I'd like to finish by praising the saga for music that I thought was inspired and outstanding for its consistency or relevance to scenes, and there are quite a few that I thought were incredibly effective. Night of Fate is so cool in these games, dude. It plays for many events, but I was especially in love with how it accompanied the first Darkwing confrontation in all versions of Key, even including the scene where Envy and Aced battle on the Daybreak Town rooftops. I love that this matches so well, and that the developers paid attention to this parallel scene. It's kind of neat how Darkwings are regularly accompanied by this piece, and not really any others. It's refreshingly specific. I also appreciate that this track is used for many of the foreteller fights in the Clock Tower, Sewer, and Fountain area. This track is kind of the auditory indicator that, things are happening, pay attention.
Restoration at 12%.
Next, the Dread of Night is used for the battle with Nightmare Chirithy after it absorbed the defeated Darklings following the confrontation in Daybreak Town. This is a very interesting repurposing of the track in the sense that important Nightmare battles can be more directly associated with this piece of music. Nightmare enemies get the dread of night, and I'm thrilled this is so solid, even compared to its uses in DDD and BBS. I just wish Nightmare Cybug also used this track. Oh well. In addition to this, Night in the Dark Dream and Night of Tragedy are both exclusively used for events concerning Corridors of Darkness, and this makes perfect sense as these are tracks that have only ever been used to accompany scenes in the Realm of Darkness. I also really liked how the game used the Dream and the Nightmare, originally from Dream Drop. You can probably surmise that the Dream was played for literal scenes where the player character was dreaming. This comes into play as foreshadowing in a few scenes, maybe most notably for the player dreaming about meeting Ephemer at the fountain. Sorry to YouTube comments, but this is not an Ephemer-specific theme. The Dream plays, which is the tip that this event didn't really happen, but there are no indications that this isn't real until Key Kid wakes up. I think it's very smartly used in these kinds of cases where the truth of the matter is sort of delayed until we see the Key Kid wake up.
We must delay the inevitable.
Unlike this track though, the Nightmare does behave like a kind of character theme for Nightmare Chirithy, which I think works so much better than really any use of the track in DDD. I mean, it's clear here that the uses in Key are less nuanced, but every single use of the track occurs while Dark Chirithy is on screen. Except for the one literal nightmare that the Key Kid has.
Restoration at 28%.
Now, Black Powder is very interesting too, and I think it's very successful for how it behaves exclusively as the battle track for the final foreteller fights in Original Key. These take place in the Keyblade Graveyard, and the parallel of fighting Master Xehanort as Terra in BBS at this location cannot be understated. It's still a little unclear what exactly the track seems to function for, since it's not used at all in the Keyblade Graveyard fights in KH3. I'd posit that maybe the track's function is just the Keyblade Graveyard battle theme when there's no special event theme to take priority. I mean, it does also play in BBS for Terra versus Braig in Radiant Garden, so maybe that's not quite it.
Of course not. His argument was unconvincing.
Okay, Gula, I don't need the sass. Maybe we can just keep this track in the back of our minds for the time being. To clarify, I do like that it seems fairly consistent with the master versus student connotation in BBS and Key, despite Braig kind of throwing a wrench into the equation.
You're putting me to sleep, bucko.
I hope that if we revisit the Keyblade Graveyard in the future, we can hear more uses of this Sekito track again, if for no other reason than to just further clarify it. Moving on, I also loved how Villains of a Sort was used in Key. I mean, so Chain of Memories often just used the track Disquieting for villain introductions and such, but Key kind of returned to the KH1 roots, and really used the piece very effectively for scenes where the Disney villains were plotting or scheming. Effective also, if only to save the audience from having to hear strange whispers for the 10,000th time. And speaking of villains, how could we forget Maleficent? Well, expectedly, there are a ton of Maleficent scenes throughout Key, but she's also notable for being really the only Disney villain that interacts with the main narrative of these games, speaking with darkness, doing time travel, conversing with new Union leaders, etc. And actually, that's this next praise. When Maleficent is confronted in the lifeboat room by Lauriam and the two prepare for battle, the track Squirming Evil plays for this sequence, and I really appreciated the parallel to KH1 here, and how Squirming Evil was also played when Sora fought Maleficent in Hollow Bastion. It was a very effective callback.
Restoration at 48%.
Oh, would you look at that, it's becoming dawn. The next track that fares exceptionally well was Tears of the Light. This is a theme of mourning and despair, as defined originally by BBS, and the track plays many times explicitly for this purpose. I thought it was particularly effective when Chirithy tells another Chirithy that its wielder fell to darkness and fades away. It's also used for some lighter misfortunes, like Wounded Gula telling Ava that he wants to summon Kingdom Hearts to bring the Master of Masters back, as well as Cinderella lamenting that she won't be able to attend the ball, And even in a parallel scene from BBS where the dwarves surround Snow White's casket. Every single use in Key was a perfect employment of this theme, intended to accompany tragedy. Now, the Key of Light might just be my favorite reused track in all of Key. It is remarkable how effectively and consistently this piece is used in this story. It only occurs 3 times. First, as the Key Kid is saved by Ephemer and Skuld after the Great Battle. Next, it plays as Ventus uses a light blast to basically delete darkness and the surrounding Darklings single-handedly. Then, finally, it plays when the player traps darkness in the Data World during the Union Cross finale. This track typically represents the idea of light prevailing against all odds, maybe sometimes in a Deus Ex Machina kind of way, but it's a track that represents hope, or unexpected sort of divine intervention. We can surmise this from every other use of it in the series, like how Ven's comatose body suddenly shoots light into the skies of Destiny Islands after being laid to rest on the Palpu tree, or as Sora and Riku's Keyblades shoot light into the depths of the Destiny Island ocean at the start of Dream Drop, saving the boys from drowning. Or even its incorporation as the ancient Keyblades in KH3 rise to help Sora defeat an unrelenting darkness, overturning fate itself. As Ericus might describe it,
"There's more to light than meets the eye."
And this definition seems to be the most succinct way of describing what this track's function is. These very few uses in Key are excellent employments of what would otherwise be much less effective tracks, like battle themes or character themes. I love how the Key of Light is used in these games.
Restoration at 79%.
And now finally, Dearly Beloved, the 1.5 recording, is used once in Key's narrative for a very important moment. The player character speaks for the first time while confronting their foreteller in the off-limits foreteller room with Skuld and Chirithy. Key Kid will briefly speak more as the story goes on, but this moment of reevaluating their convictions, what the purpose of unions even are, and ultimately reaffirming their friendship with Ephemer by raising their Keyblade for battle, this moment represents a turning point in the story. From a meta-narrative point of view, this will also be the first time the audience is aware of the Key Kid being a free agent. They're not exactly the silent protagonist to project onto that we've expected for the first 500 quests up until now. And because of this scene's importance, no other track could be quite as fitting for this monumental moment as the very first piece that ever played in the Kingdom Hearts series. This scene, and this track's use, are incredibly effective.
Restoration at 97%.
We are now finished discussing all the notable specific musical decisions within the Key Saga. Ultimately, understanding how each game was able to carve out its own soundscape, with their own, at times, unique musical choices, helps to illuminate how these games are remembered, and how the scenario writing team has generally improved with their sound design. Honestly, there were quite a few ineffective choices. Starting the whole experience with Memories in Pieces, or strange whispers accompanying so much of the text box dialogue, these decisions exemplify tracks that would lead to confusion at best and musical fatigue at worst. Even some choices employed in original Key feel more solid than the ports by maintaining a more consistent game flow, as is the case with the better Target Quest battle music. However, there are tracks in the later entries that also rise to our expectations much more appropriately. Back Cover makes forward strides in its scenes where it brings back forgotten melodies from earlier in the series, like Scent of Silence and Tears of the Light. Even Union Cross strengthened all of its UI menu music, raid boss battle tracks, and even included experimental metal music. Metal music. Let's take a breather. We started this analysis by talking about the Key Saga's original tracks, how they were composed and for what purpose they generally served in the narrative. Then, we discussed notable differences between any shared scenes in order to understand how different pieces of music in these games can be used to clarify some narrative point. Then finally, we've discussed here some of these special pieces designed to accentuate gameplay or scenario events, with their, at times, surprising diversity.
I just prefer to be thorough.
I think with this finished, we've now talked about every single interesting piece of music from throughout the last 8 years of the Key Saga. All their uses, all their compositional quirks, and all their narrative implications. And now, all that's left is to address the lasting musical impact Key would have on the rest of the Kingdom Hearts series. Key's lasting musical impact on the Kingdom Hearts series.
You been here long? My bad.
Despite how lengthy this analysis has been, believe me when I tell you that we've only just scratched the surface of how the music of the Key Saga was used. We could have easily talked about the more unremarkable, albeit interesting, uses of tracks like Gearing Up and Blast Away Gummy Ship 1 for a side quest involving rebuilding Goofy and Donald's ship, or how Treasured Memories plays while Strelitzia watches the player from the Daybreak Town rooftops, and again when Ephemer remembers the Key Kid's sacrifice before boarding his lifeboat. I mean, shoot, we didn't even really talk about all the interesting scenes that used no music, like when foreteller Ira tells the player character to prepare for war, or when Skuld and Ephemer step outside the Daybreak Clock Tower to watch the end of the world. There's really an incredible wealth of musical interest that can be found throughout the Key Saga, and this series of titles, if nothing else, demonstrated unequivocally how well-rooted the soundtrack of the whole Kingdom Hearts series has grown. With designations of tracks as field battle, event, and character themes, it may be obvious in retrospect that Key would reuse many of these older pieces to redefine the soundscapes of worlds and situations as they had been previously expressed in other games. Reusing older tracks isn't exactly new for the series, but never before has there been so many pieces of music to draw from. Because of this, the music implementation team, now more than ever, has a humongous responsibility to reinforce musical associations to the audience with appropriate track reuse. And being able to do this effectively will only become more difficult as the number of pieces in this series grows, and the desire to reuse pieces effectively remains. I think, though, that the Key games do reuse pieces quite successfully. There are some tracks that I think were weak or ineffective choices, don't get me wrong, but over the course of the Key Saga's 8-year lifespan, it's really remarkable how consistently that tonally matching music for different scenes was employed. There are tons of examples of this in every Key title, ranging from Friends in My Heart playing in back cover while Ephemer speaks about making a friend, to how Union Cross would use something like Go Go Rumble Racer for the Cart Bakery field and battle theme, while Ralph and Vanellope build a vehicle. Pulls like these demonstrated to me that the music team really cares a great deal about preserving musical consistency with music from across the series, even if they may sometimes miss. With the franchise having such an enormous history of music, what I found significant was that certain tracks that share the same function would be chosen over others, and that sometimes 2 or more pieces with a similar function would occur in different points in the story. These musical redundancies demonstrate how structured the soundtracks to these games have been, and how easily replaceable these kinds of tracks can be. Pieces like Innocent Times, Laughter and Merriment, A Walk in Andante, and Little Lovely Moments would all accompany some sort of calm fluff, where Disney characters were making jokes or the player character was interacting with their friends. Even tracks like Drops of Poison, Villains of a Sort, and Strange Whispers in the Key early game were generally used to accompany acts of Disney villainy. Then we have pieces like Ever After and Peaceful Hearts, which play pretty exclusively for the resolution of a Disney world. Considering the future of the series, these redundancies give us some evidence that we should expect to hear reused melodies as new games are developed, which we've seen consistently happen more and more since Chain of Memories. With the end of the series' first arc, though, it makes me incredibly curious if the next arc for Kingdom Hearts will preserve this tradition or abandon it. Individually, all the titles in the Key Saga added to the series' musical narrative, and collectively, the musical story they tell is quite the behemoth. Original Key was mostly content with reinforcing traditional pieces for the many world revisits, as well as using older event tracks to help break the relative monotony of the constant field and battle themes. We've come to expect this kind of musical employment in the series. These pieces usually serve to highlight generic villain scheming or some quest conclusion. This sort of traditional track reuse will occur in the later titles as well, but I think to a much lesser extent. The new music for Original Key only included the new Dearly Beloved and the field and battle tracks for Daybreak Town, neither of which were used in an especially descriptive or narratively influential way. Back Cover, for its part, does do a little more with its music to complement the story, and this has surely helped with its introduction of 4 new event and character themes. While some pieces, like The Foretellers and Master of Masters, are extremely specific in what they imply when used, other tracks like Scala ad Caelum and Passing the Power are functionally a little bit more ambiguous, and will hopefully become more clear as they are reused, along with the rest of the ever-growing repertoire of the series' soundtrack. Back Cover also musically excels in how it goes out of its way to describe the nature of characters or events without wasting time on lengthy monologue, like how it used a version of Dream Eaters to introduce Chirithy, or using, for example, Tears of the Light to relate Gula's frantic desire to bring the Master back to the scenes of tragedy that this track was used for in BBS. This movie also pulls some older themes and uses them to deepen and clarify the emotional impact of scenes that the mobile games just use generic field themes for, like Ava and Ephemer speaking at the fountain, or the many uses of Calm's remorse theme, Scent of Silence, to give the Foreteller speaking scenes a blanket of unease. Meanwhile, Unchained Key and Union Cross would be the real giants when it came to impacting the overall musical narrative of the series. These games would often expand the use cases of older tracks, but also making them more specific to the situations they play for, and giving these pieces pretty tight definitions by doing so. Immediate examples that come to mind are the Key of Light becoming a powerful auditory indicator of divine intervention. Tracks like The Nightmare and The Dread of Night are now more closely associated with nightmares, and specifically Nightmare Chirithy, than they've ever been. Even one-off events that occurred in Union Cross would have thoughtful music uses that would call back to some specific prior use earlier in the series, like the Summer Adventure Quest, or Sephiroth challenges, or even the Moogla Glory Gummy Ship stuff. There are examples of musical thoughtfulness sprinkled all over these games that indicated that the music implementation team had a thorough understanding of how to deepen the story with an appropriate, interrelated piece of music. Not all of the Key Saga's musical impact on the series would be positive, though. I think these titles would be many folks' last straw when it comes to hearing Strange Whispers, Road to a Hero, or Rowdy Rumble again, all of which I think have had their purpose become shells of their former selves, unfortunately. Luckily, the Kingdom Hearts discography is so large, with so many musical redundancies, that I don't think there would be much lost if the developers just took a step back from using these pieces again. This obviously won't happen. I expect that these pieces will continue to show up frequently in the future of the series, but I'm just saying that there are many underutilized tracks that could serve the exact same purpose and increase the musical diversity in a way that using these will struggle to do from here on out. Now, unlike Kingdom Hearts Coded, Key does not seem to be focused on practically being a recap of previous games. There are familiar plot points that are hit, but Key seems much more interested in carving out its own space in the canon, and this goal is helped tremendously by its many original arrangements. Thinking about how Key was able to use older tracks in its storyline is one matter, but how it incorporated its originals is an entirely different one. From tracks like Before the Daylight and Wake Up World to Passing the Power and The Foretellers, Yoko Shimomura was able to design a unique musical expression for this story collection in how she tied all of her new compositions together by having them relate to one another with a shared compositional philosophy. Her originals all employed an idea of modulation, that there are two sections with two different pitch centers in these tracks. This seems unlikely to be strictly coincidence, given what we know about her conscious efforts to write purposeful music in prior games, so it seems likely that Shimomura may have been intentionally and subtly trying to incorporate an expression of duality into her music. In addition to this, Shimomura seemed to be much more readily exploring tonal systems and how all of these tracks she wrote would be structured around modified seventh modes. She's written modal music in prior games, but never really to this extent. Her work is unique to the Key Saga. These compositional identifiers give everything she wrote for Key a similar logic, creating a legacy that will echo long beyond the Darkseeker's arc. Okay, have I talked about every piece of music in this series of titles? No, I haven't. But I hope that I've been able to demonstrate and provide compelling examples for the following 3 claims. 1. That the Key Saga's music contains many unique compositional ideas that are explored substantially for the first time in the series, and this gives the games a strong musical identity. 2. That similar scenes can use different pieces of music, and that individual track choices affect the interpretation of any particular story beat. And 3. That there exist many tracks used in these games whose function would become fundamentally transformed with their many uses in these titles. By exploring with you how the music of the Key Saga has contributed to the musical tradition of the series, I hope I've been able to express how these games not only pay homage to the past, but also how they have set up musical arcs to be resolved in the future as well. Thanks for watching. In the next video, we will conclude our deconstruction of the Darkseeker's arc by exploring the music of Kingdom Hearts 3. This game arguably features some of the strongest and weakest original pieces in the entire series. Aside from exploring how the composers and many arrangers will reinvent familiar melodies, there will also be quite a lot of experimentation in the way that the soundtrack builds upon the work from Dream Drop, 0.2, and even the Key Saga. Kingdom Hearts 3 will be a true testament to the undeniable strength of Shimomura's melodies that have been constructed and reinforced over the previous 17 years.